I'm Brian.
And I'm Lee.
And today we're going to build a farmhouse bench.
I'm Lee and Brian, DIY. Hey guys, what's up? Thanks for joining us today. Lee here from Lee and Brian DIY. What we have here is a farmhouse bench. And on today's episode, we're going to show you step by step how to make it.
Alright, so the lumber we need today is we need a 1-inch board like this. It can be glued together, or if you go to Home Depot, they might have something pre-made just like this that you can use. We also are going to be using a 1.5 inch. This is going to be for our legs, and we have 3/4 inch, and this is going to be for some of the supports underneath. So we're using maple today, but you can use anything you want. Any sort of hardwood's going to work. You can even go softwood too, but it might scratch up a little easier.
Yeah, so what I'm doing right now is I'm flushing this end up so we can butt it up to a stop and cut it to a finished length. So I do this so you can have two consistent finished cuts on both sides of the board. It gives it a much more professional look, and when all your sides are square, it's a lot easier to work with. Cool. Since we have an 1-inch thick board here, we're gonna want to have our legs about 19 inches. So we're gonna go back with the chop saw. So you can do whatever you would like on this bench, but I'm going to put a pitch on my legs. So instead of being straight up like this, they're just gonna tilt back just a little bit as a little character. I find the pitch by, I tilt it, see what looks nice, and then I take a mental note of how wide this gap is, and I mark on this side with the pencil about the same height up the leg. So this angle turned out to be 6 degrees, and I thought it looked great. You guys can do whatever angle that you want. Now we have our one side cut. We need to cut the other side on the opposite end so it'll sit flat on the ground. Now we have both of the same angles on here. This will sit nice and flat. I'm cutting our 3/4 inch piece down to 2.5 inches so we can plane it down to 2 3/8. I'm gonna use a planer because it saves me time and it gives it a nice professional look, but if you don't have a planer, you can hand sand. 2.5 and 2 3/8 aren't specific measurements at all. I just like the look of that thickness. This is the stretcher. This was gonna be the piece that connects, but looking at it now, it's gonna be a little bit thick for our build. This is personal preference. So I picked a thinner piece, but you can do whatever your creative mind thinks. Of course, we're gonna have 4 legs here, but we're gonna add what's called skirting around the bottom to add some rigidity to the seat and to dress it up a little bit. In this section of the tutorial, we'll be building the leg structure of the farmhouse bench. You'll need the legs of the bench, the small style that we made. They won't have holes in the bottoms yet, but I'll get to that. A square, a Craig jig drill bit, a pencil, glue, Craig jig screws, a Milwaukee 90-degree bit driver, and a Craig jig. This little guy right here is called a Craig jig. So I'm using this Craig jig to make holes into my wood that are invisible. So I put the 2 Craig jig holes on the bottom of my stretcher, so when you attach to the leg, you won't see it. With the Craig jig, you gotta ease into your screw hole because the little tips of these bits are really easy to break off. Especially with hard maple, that bit is really easy to break, so all I'm doing here is deciding where I want my stiles to sit on the bottom of my bench leg. There are no specific measurements I'm using. I'm just going off of what I think looks good, but I think I used 3 inches off the bottom of the leg for the style to go on. Feel free to take as much time in this section as you want. It's very important to be meticulous at this stage because you want your bench to sit without a wobble. To do the other side, just flip the first leg over and use the 90-degree bit driver to drive that last screw in. When all said and done, you should have that. So now we got these little stiles in between the legs. Put the long one in the middle. So find the center of the stile between the legs. Then line the middle of your long stile up with that center point you just found, clamp it, screw it together, and then repeat. Good catch. That would have been an embarrassing mistake. Now I have the bottom of a farmhouse bench. To double check myself, I mitered a piece of scrap, piece of wood, and just to make sure my angle is right. I then cut one end of my skirt to that angle, and then line it up with the leg. Mark the other side, and cut on my line. After you have all the pieces of your skirt cut, use your Craig jig to make your invisible holes at the bottom of your skirting. So now we got all the Craig jig holes in our piece here. I'm gonna attach everything to the legs before I do anything with the top. I always work with gravity, so the less you actually have to hold, the better. Once you have your legs flipped so the stiles are pointing up, find the center of your skirt and that side of the leg, glue it, and then line them up and screw it together. It's kind of hard to see what's square and what's not, so I always just take a scrap piece of wood that's about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and I just set it up on top of where I want it to be flush with. So this line right here, all I want to do is make sure the outside and the inside both touch this scrap piece of wood. This is a Milwaukee 90-degree bit driver. You can buy that at Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, but we'll put it in the description down below. And that is your legs, and now we gotta work on the top. So the first round of sandpaper, I usually use 80 grit. It gets most of the blemishes off of the top of the wood faster. And then the second round that I'm gonna go through is a 120, just to smooth it out and give it a nice soft finish. Any higher than that, you start to get a glossy effect happening, especially with hard maple, and then the stain doesn't stick as evenly. Orbital sanders work really well, but they leave swirls in the wood, and you can see that once you stain it. So I'm gonna use this, which is a drywall sander, and try to get those swirls out. Stick with 120 grit sandpaper for your drywall sander, and make sure you only sand with the grain. Any thicker grit of sandpaper is probably not gonna give you an ideal finish point, and if you go against the grain, you'll make scratches you really can't get rid of. When I cut this on the miter saw, I burnt it a little bit, so I'm gonna use a block sander with a piece of 80 grit on it, and try to even the color up. As you can see, it works pretty good. Evens the color up on the edge, so you don't have such a discrepancy in your stain. Just as I was hitting these edges with a block sander, you can hit the long edges too to get the saw marks away. I'm just gonna save some time and use this belt sander. If you also have a big belt sander, you can use it too. It doesn't matter, you can do it both ways. Make sure you catch all the glue overspill that you've done, because the stain won't stick to glue and you'll see a really big glue spot. So just double check, make sure everything is sanded well. Well, we got our bench seat done now, so we can attach it to the legs. Now I have enough Craig jig screw holes in here to hold this all together, so don't really need to glue it. But if you feel like you need to glue yours, feel free to glue everything together. I'm going with an inch overhang on my top because that's about how far my legs stick out with the pitch I have. Get my closest piece. You just drill one screw in, make sure nothing moved. Double check all my measurements. See, this side moved a little bit, so make sure you always double check after your first screw. And there you have it, a farmhouse bench. To see how we stained this project, check out the link in the description. And remember, like or subscribe to keep up with our latest videos and more DIY content.